So welcome everybody. We are here for the second session of this morning. There has been a change in the program, a slight one since Fernando Esposito unfortunately cannot be here. We moved Maciej Janowski's paper to this session, so the sequence will be Professor Gilad Ben-Nun, then Professor Janowski, then Professor Troebst, and Professor Turda. This morning we will have more time for the general discussion in the afternoon. So Gilad Ben-Nun, please, I give you the floor. The title of his paper is Purveyors of Synchronization, Jews, Jewish Law, and the Making of International Law. You have the floor, please.
Leave it this way. I'm not. Thanks. The microphone, please. Mike. Yeah. Basically, this is work that I've been doing for the past since 2012 approximately, to try and understand this question of a clear phenomenon of synchronization, which is modern international law. Law of nations, jus gentium, we have at least since the Bible, if you look at the book of Deuteronomy, certainly the Romans, and so on. But international law, in the sense of non-state institutions which state go up to. So if you take what's happening now, for example, at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, if you go 200 years back, Metternich would have been appalled by the very idea that a state can take another state to a non-state court. That would have been anathema to someone like Metternich, let alone the fact that states can sue other states and that there's something which is non-state above the state. The birth of international law is basically a classical case of synchronization in the sense that it is a phenomenon which is born somewhere around 1880, 1890. The first court we actually have, which is a permanent court of arbitration, is 1907, but that's still arbitration. So states are supreme. The ICJ, we know today, the same statute, identical, is written in 1920 by Donizio Anzelotti at the time, under the League of Nations. Now, the assumption here, of course, is that this type of synchronization goes with another phenomenon, which is secularization. I was the Alfred Gosser chair at Sciences Po, and I had to deliver the second year lecture series on the introduction to public international law. And of course, the classical book, Joignier, who's one of the famous professors in the Sorbonne, international law, served as a secularized, eschatological model replacing the role of religion very clearly. So religion is out. Synchronization and modernism is secular, at least in this field. So went the theory. Peter Gay, you know, the book, The Enlightenment, the rise of modern paganism, right? Which would be the direct counterpart to it. So far, so good. Then I started working on a series of books. One of them won the National Jewish Book Award, on who wrote what. The series of treaties that basically run our world, give and take a few hours, run our world today. And I found something rather peculiar. And here's a list of the treaties that we still work today. And if you look at the list, virtually all of the authors were Jews. So the UN Charter is written in Brookings Institute by Leo Pasvolsky. We know that. Pasvolsky is a Ukrainian Jew. In fact, I would even say that it is limited to this Romanian area from here, basically up until Lemberg. Vespasian Pella comes from here, is Raphael Lemkin's Genocide Convention Mafia, and so on. I can tell you, but this is an East Central European Jewish phenomenon to a point of complete disproportionality. Pasvolsky writes the UN Charter. Lauterpacht writes, who comes from this region, goes to his PhD with Kelsen in Vienna, hardly passes through, and goes again to the UK, becomes Lauterpacht, writes the Nuremberg Tribunal, Crimes Against Humanity, Genocide Convention. You know the story of Lemkin and Pella, but Lemkin is the main maker and the shaker. René Cassin does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a Bill of Rights that Lauterbach does before, and then the European Convention of Human Rights, 1950, I remind you, was the first chair. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which is really my finding, I didn't know this, but I should mention in terms of synchronization. That is to say, when we speak of something which is universal, I boil this down to a very concrete example because there's one single unique treaty in the entire history of modern international law, which has been signed and ratified by all UN member states, which is the Fourth Geneva Convention. No other treaty, not the Refugee Convention, not the WTO, whatever you want. That, of course, the UN Charter, but that's procedural. Not even the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations. Okay, so there's one which, when we speak of a universal phenomenon, something we've all signed up to, then the Fourth Geneva Convention is the par excellence example, written by 3 Holocaust surviving Jews: Georges Cahen Salvador, who was the vice president of the Conseil d'État in France, to René Cassin, in fact. Nissim Evorach, who's a neighbor from Bulgaria, who was chosen by Stalin as the Soviet representative in that, Jew, Sephardic, creator of the Bulgarian Communist Party in 1920, and so on. Later, the Bulgarian ambassador to the US, by the way, interestingly enough, and so on. And Rabbi Dr. Georg Kohn, who was the Danish delegate to the convention, saved by the scuff of his neck in 1943 to Sweden. I think it is very interesting, and we just heard Hegel here, and I agree with my previous. I'm very happy actually to present after Balash and after Lisi because they kind of opened the door to bring non-secular thinking into this debate on synchronization. Think of the historical irony that the person who prohibited the creation of settlements in the Fourth Geneva Convention, so Article 49, paragraph 6, is single-handedly Rabbi Dr. Georg Kohn from Denmark. Right? I think it's a very interesting when you think of what's happening in certain other places in the neck of the woods. The Refugee Convention, Jacob Robinson was the maker and the shaker. I did a lot about that. Rabbi Yitzhak Levin, who was the ultra-Orthodox representative of Agudat Israel, which is the Haredi, to the UN, wrote non-refoulement. So when we today discuss Hirsi Jama versus Italy, 2012, on whether migrants on the sea have the right to be protected from non-refoulement, non-refoulement is written single-handedly, right? No country shall return a refugee to places where he or she shall be tormented, basically. That is written by Yitzhak Levin, and it is written by Yitzhak Levin as a paraphrase on the book of Amos, okay, which, interestingly enough, is struck out by the UN protocol. So I found that's a set of articles not in the UN archives, which was struck out because we know what UN protocols are. They are what we agree that will be stuck into the protocol, not what actually happened in the session, but rather in the Agudat Israel archive in New York, right? These are, right, you have the book that won the National Jewish Book Award. Those are the articles where Yitzhak Levin and that biblical stuff, and that's basically the book where the Jewish side of it kind of came through. And this already brought me to this bigger question of the Jewish disproportionality conundrum. Right? This issue of this is completely disproportionate. Now, if you look at the list, I deliberately marked in green people who came with a dual, and this was the classical example, especially from this region. René Cassin is a bit off, but Georges Cahen Salvador, who was a secular French, long-standing, but everybody else in this list follows the exact same identical biography, which is a complete dual type of education. So these people grow up in religious Orthodox homes in East Central Europe, anywhere from Lemberg to Königsberg at the time, to this area very much, Chernovitz and so on. They all have a rabbinical education at home from their parents, which means Rashi, which means Talmud, which means all of that, which means synagogues, which means language capacities, because once you read Rashi, you have to know French and German, although he's writing in Hebrew in a different script. And once you read the Torah, the normal Torah every week, you're reading Aramaic, because Onkelos is in order to understand the Hebrew, you need the Aramaic. So the multilinguality is already built in. And then these guys go into the story. They were born 1870, 89, 1880. So they go directly to what? If you think of someone like Lemkin, doctorate in public international law, in the Mecca of international law, which is Lemberg. And they all, so if it's not that, then Robinson does it in Warsaw. Robinson's brother, which is Nehemiah Robinson, does it in Jena. It's always German speaking, by the way. I think it's very interesting. They all go to, and they have this dual education. That's their construct in the mind, all these people. And that got me thinking. I said, okay, why them? Like, why not Calvinist Huguenots or Armenians, right? Because we always say the Jews wrote it because they're persecuted. The Jews were, but Armenians was also persecuted and genocide. And they're the same kind of diaspora, educated all over the place, Ottoman Empire, right? So why not them? Why the Jews? And it had to be something in that education. And I think the missing point, and this is my point here on synchronization, is the sort of backlog shadow metalogical structure, which is also very much religious. And what do I mean? I went into this to try and answer, and it went through several areas. One was a moral drive, which is 2 articles, one of them actually in the last book by a very good legal historian by the name of Michael Stolais, who passed away. He was the head of Max Planck Institute for Rechtsgeschichte in Frankfurt. Just now we'll get to the moral drive. There is a textualism and polyglot drive, but then there is a structural one. And I want to get into the structural one. The article there won the Spotlight Award for the Journal of History and International Law. And I want you to think of this. For a German BGB lawyer, the idea of modern international law is anathema to be called law. In fact, if you read E.H. Carr, The 20-Year Crisis, you'll see that Carr says to us, this, and he published it, right? 1 month before World War II comes out. He says this international stuff is horseshit. It's not law. Why is it not law? First of all, there's no living legislator. The traité loi, well, we can accede to the treaty, we can rescind from the treaty, we can accede with reservations, right? It's not a legislator. You can't accede to the next law of parking tickets that the municipality of Bucharest does. Second, so there's no living legislator. Second, the system cannot change the legislation because no one can change the Torah or no one can change the UN Charter. Think of it. How many years have we been talking about reform of the UN Charter? We can't do it. So how do the system progress? They progress through judicial interpretation of the same treaty, right? In the case of Jewish law, of course, rabbinical courts. Look at how far they have come from Torah in terms of the 3,000 years of. And if you think of, it's very interesting, if you think of the ICJ, for example, here's a fact for you. If you go to a rabbinical court and there is a discussion on custody of children between 2 divorced parents, there is a regulation in the rabbinical court that the rabbis are not allowed to get up. It's like a conclave of the Pope. They're not allowed to walk out of the session without a decision. Why? Because a child cannot be in limbo. Same thing in the ICJ. Don't you find it interesting that there was what we call non-liquid, the condition of an indecision of the court? In 100 years of the ICJ, there's no non-liquid. The closest we ever came was the advisory opinion on nuclear weapons, where the president cast the primus inter pares vote, right? Because why? Because if the ICJ goes to non-liquid, we have war. Lastly, both systems don't have coercion. Right? What are you going to do? How are you going to coerce North Korea to whatever do what? How are you going to coerce Baruch Spinoza not to say what he's saying? Well, but what was the worst that the Jewish Gemeinde of Amsterdam can do? They can excommunicate Spinoza. No showing. Mehr nicht. But that does not mean to say that they are not legal systems. And this is a very interesting point that Lauterbach says in 1938 against the critique of people like E.H. Carr. He says, for a legal system to exist, you don't need a living legislator, nor do you need coercion. The distinctive feature of a legal system, whether it is a legal system or custom, is whether there is a court and a judge. And this, of course, Lauterbach takes from where? He goes 2,000 years back to the 7 high laws, the 7 laws of Noach. I remind you this concept of late antiquity, where 6 prohibitions, right? No adultery, no murder, no cursing of God, no eating of, tearing the flesh of an animal and eating it without killing it, right? No fornication, that's 5 and 6. And the last one, which is the only flicht. So it's 6 prohibitions and 1 flicht, which is, of course, the maintenance of courts of law. Tonizio Anzelotti puts it into Article 38 of the ICJ statute. If you remember, how shall the court judge? By all systems of law of civilized people. Civilized people meaning the 7 laws of Noah. The point I'm trying to make here is, and this is what the point I made, and I demonstrated this in this article, also in the famous discussions between Kelsen and Lauterpacht and Kelsen and Rabbi Dr. Gero Kohn, who wrote the Fourth Geneva Convention, were very close friends, and they didn't agree on the role of the judge, because Kelsen was this, I don't know, and this difference between common law and continental law. Common law, the judges have a very wide margin, continental law, very narrow. Even Kelsen changes his mind. What I'm trying to say is the role of the judge in international law basically comes from halachic law. And here, before I finish in terms of going back to languages for a second, but before that, it's interesting. And it's a quote that in a secret telegram, Jacob Robinson writes to the Israeli Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet in the drafting of the Refugee Convention on great Talmudic minds in the drafting, people like Louis Henkin and others who are there on the table. Henkin represents the US accidentally. The last Rashi on the Torah. So the very last commentary of Rashi on the entire 5 books, which is the last 3 words of the Torah are Leinei Kol Israel, into the eyes of all of Israel. And Rashi solves through this judge issue a conundrum which perturbed Judaism, including the Talmud, for 3,000 years. And the conundrum was, by what right did Moses break the first set of the 10 Commandments? I remind you, in the book of Exodus, the first time Moses goes up to the mountain, the first set is written, Be'etzba Elohim, in the finger of God. He comes down, he sees the golden calf, breaks them, then Daditata, whatever goes up. In the second set, God says to Moses, you write them. 2,000 years, the Talmud didn't have an answer. Right? No one had an answer really of by what right did Moses break the 10 Commandments, right? The basic law. And Rashi, at the end of his commentary, and only Rashi could do that in the sense of this gigantic mind of putting everything together, and it's not to an accident that since his commentary, he has been, for Ashkenazis, for Yemenites, for Sfaradim, for anybody, right? 2 legs of Judaism, Maimonides and Rashi. Rashi says, I quote it in Hebrew first of all, שנשאו ליבו לשבור את הלוחות, והסכימה דעתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, שאמר לו, אשר שברת, ישר כוחך ששברת. That his heart, and heart in Rashi's mind, brought him to break the tablets. And the opinion of the Almighty, post eventum, conceded with Moses and said to him, that which you have broken, that you have broken, which is the overridingness of the judge on the ground to the law that was written. I, God, give the law, I'm out. I'm transcendental. The rest is for you guys. And if you choose that the best way of effectuation to get my law to work is to break it, you're the judge. I'm the original legislator, I'm no longer there. And it's a passage that Robinson walks into and quotes. And I thought that it was a very interesting understanding of how international law would probably work. Think of a simple example. I was a UN diplomat for 10 years. You are welcome to open the UN Charter and show me anywhere where the word peacekeeping is mentioned. And I remind everybody that the DPKO today, Department of Peacekeeping Operation, is double the size. So it is, the budget of DPKO today is the Secretariat and the UNHCR combined. DPKO is still bigger. And we know it's one entire exercise by Douglas Hammarskjöld on Uniting for Peace 1950, and then the first force, which is UNF after the Suez Canal crisis, there is no existence of peacekeeping by armed forces in the Charter. So what is it? Judicial interpretation. Languages. This is the big sort of bibliography that Robinson did in 1928 for the minorities problem. He was the minority expert of the League of Nations. I think this polyglot thing, right? This bibliography is polyglot. Works presented here in the languages that the editor can read freely include publications in Russian, Lithuanian, Latvian, Polish, Ukrainian, Czech, German, Dano, Norwegian, Swedish, Dutch, French, Italian, Catalan, Romanian, Spanish, Bulgarian, English, Hebrew, and Yiddish. Sources of the last two languages have been transcribed into Latin characters. Notwithstanding the editor's limited knowledge of Hungarian, he nevertheless endeavored to include those Hungarian publications known to him. Right? This was the, but you get to this type of polyglottism through that education as a child, because you brought up, first of all, in the languages of that Bible, Hebrew, Aramaic, Russian, and so on. Then you're in East Central Europe before World War II. So you're in a normal area which speaks, any one of these, Lemberg or any one of these cities speaks 4 or 5 languages, right, normally. And you get there. It's not very off mark. In terms of the motivation, and here we can go back to something that is quoted, the 3 O's of Traktat Ketubot. I won't bother you too much with it. You can see it in the articles. But the moral decree of Jeremiah, which still is relevant because today, if you look, for example, at the flicht of Jews in foreign countries, in the United Kingdom, for example, in the US, to serve in the armed forces of these countries, the halachic decree is Jeremiah's decree, which was, and seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away as exile. Right? This is the letter of exile to Babylon by Jeremiah, and pray unto the Lord for it, for in its peace, therefore, you shall have peace. And that is basically the driving. This is the eulogy to Jacob Robinson, Bar Shabtai Rosen, one of the most famous Israeli experts on the ICJ, where he says, you know, Robinson said that Israel should make every effort to take part in UN's activities and make them a contribution based on intrinsic quality, not mere political power. A 20th century projection, 20th century synchronism projection of the prophet Zechariah's, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, into the harshness of international politics. That's the sort of moral drive side of things. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that it will give us opportunities for discussion in the general debate now. Please, Maciej Janowski, you have the floor. The title of your paper is Praise of Periphery, Mountains as a Land of Liberty Between Literary Topos and Socio-Political Reality. Are you coming? Yeah, because we can hear you and we can record it.
Okay, because it's like sermon from a council, which I'm not that accustomed to. Okay, dear colleagues, would like first to thank Sorin for invitation for this conference, and I'm very happy to be here and to see some of CEU faces not seen for a long time, and also being able to meeting people whom I didn't know. And my main professional historical, so to say, genre is intellectual history. And when I was approached by Sorin with the idea of a conference paper on synchronisms and asynchronisms, my first idea would be to say something about Ludwik Krzyzewski and Szujski and Polish intellectuals of the 19th century who were dealing with more or less similar way things as Slovinescu, Majorescu, and the guys we were talking about in somehow different intellectual contexts. But then I thought it will be repeating myself after all, because I had privilege of taking part in writing the Negotiating Modernities volumes edited by Balasz, and whatever I knew about Polish aspects of asynchronism I put already into that book. And as it happened, in last 2 years, I was engaged in writing History of the Carpathian Mountains, which is came somehow aside from my main research interest. I thought at a certain moment that 55 years of mountain hikings every summer probably would need to be fructified somehow. And then at certain moment, writing the History of Carpathians, which was also meant to be for myself a proof that I'm able to write not only about what people think, but also about what wir es eigentlich gewesen, also what really happened in social reality, that these topics have, but this History of Carpathians has actually much more in common with intellectual history than I supposed when I was starting dealing with this. And I thought that I will try to connect these two fields of research. And I would like to say something about concept and reality of mountain liberty or liberty in the mountains, with probably some very few theoretical reflections afterwards. So the idea that there is liberty in the mountains is something which everybody knows is a very well-known topic, and one could make a history of this concept topic of one, not only of a single paper, but of a whole book. And I don't want to indulge in this in much details, but I would like to pinpoint some important elements of it. So, whereas, of course, the concept is probably became famous and became overwhelmingly popular in 19th century with the period of Romanticism and with demand for simple folk who preserves ancient customs from times immemorial. You all know the story perfectly well. So it has certain sort of prehistory. We may turn to the idea, or if we look into early modern documents dealing especially with prescriptions of feudal duties of various rural populations to the landlords or the king or whomever, then quite often, both in Polish and in Hungarian case, we find phrases that village such and such in Montanis, they do not have serfdom. And with this, so there is at least consciousness that there is something different with these mountains, to which I come in a moment. There is also something which is present in European culture from times immemorial, what Johann Huizinga in one of his essays called pastoral ideal of life, claiming that pastoral ideal of life is one of the central ideals, or probably we may say role models in European culture since antiquity, pastoral simplicity, and so on. Again, the story is well known, because so it happened that for geophysical reasons, sheep grazing is more developed in the mountains than in the plains. Then this pastoral ideals of life has tendency to mix itself with the ideal of mountain life. Nevertheless, in order for idea of mountain liberty to become full-fledged, I believe Romanticism must have come with the ideological justification of mountains' beauty. And here, of course, we have the concept of the sublime, which was already mentioned yesterday at some of the papers. And already turn of 18th and 19th century authors who are frightened by mountains' faith and wilderness and whatsoever are more or less fascinated by them. And then, of course, as we know, in whole Europe comes Walter Scott, and he teaches Europeans that mountains are actually wonderful, beautiful, whatsoever. Then this ideal comes to be nationalized, and all national movements are claiming that mountaineers are part of preservators of most ancient features of the nation. If we turn to one of the most popular Polish historical novels of the turn of 19th to 20th century, to Henryk Sienkiewicz's The Teutonic Knights, then we see how Sienkiewicz very adroitly, because well, Sienkiewicz was probably not a great writer in terms of psychology, in terms of depth whatsoever. He was a very good writer, also technically, in terms of how he knew how to write a novel. So how he beautifully creates a fictitious Polish 15th century language out of Tatra mountaineers' dialect. So here we have a wonderful example of this mental asynchronism, and we are right at the center of our topic. There is the idea that these mountains are in a sense Uchronia, not only utopia, but Uchronia, in which they are residing outside of time scale and preserving an ancient feature. Another similar example, probably even more interesting, because is by the way, there are also some, which I will not enter into linguistics, but there are some funny examples how Jugendstil Polish intellectuals created some fictitious folk terms, fictitious ancient Polish language terms by misunderstanding or mishearing certain terms that the Tatra mountaineers were using. But I'm sure from every language you can find such examples. Good also example of this Uchronic attitude is the early research of wooden Carpathian churches, which are of course so common as you know in Romania, but they are also in Ukrainian Carpathians and also in Polish Carpathians. And the idea of such people as Stanisław Witkiewicz, so inventors of this national style in architecture, was that these churches are remnants of all pagan temples of Ur-Slavish, yes, Slavonic, old pagan temples. Of course, it is nonsense. What Sorin was telling yesterday, I think, during our trip, not on the conference, but actually most of them are Gothic. They are transposition of high Gothic art into wooden architecture. It's true about Maramuresh churches with their beautiful spires. It's also true of Polish Podhale, Subcarpathian churches. Now there are researches of art history, art historians demonstrating sufficiently well that they were not built by the peasants out of their own spontaneous aesthetic feelings, but that they were hiring the builders from the cities who were knowing about architectural trends and trying to transform these trends into timber, which of course doesn't change the fact that there may have been some elements of ornamentality of these churches that are older, but still this idea of reconstructing of old pagan temple of wooden church is a perfect example of this belief of mountain Uchronic antiquity undisturbed by external influences. Probably more interesting, or at least more charming, I would say, is another way of romanticizing mountains, which is anti-nationalist, and of which the main example in Poland is Stanisław Vincents with his tetralogy on the High Alm, on the life of the Huculs, in which Huculs are monumentalized, but not monumentalized in a sense out of Polish-Ukrainian content on whose Huculs really are and whose national traits they display. They are monumentalized as Platonic Atlantida people of prehistory, which live their own life outside of any nationalism. Vincenz was rather left liberal. He was very wary of Polish radical nationalism and was trying to build this picture of the Huculs as such primordial people outside of national conflict. It's not one of researchers made excellent comparison. I think it's very good comparison. It's only pity that it's not me who invented it. Is that if there is any comparison with the Huculs, then they are like hobbits in Tolkien, and this Hucul land in Vincenz is like the Tolkienian invented Middle Earth word. Okay, and we could go on longer in much more details about this stereotype of mountains and mountain liberty. It is what struck me when writing this book was, so to say, that the stereotype does actually have some real ground. I remember my late supervisor Jerzy Jedlicki telling at a lecture when I was undergraduate that when researching stereotypes, it usually doesn't pay off to ask what is the relation between stereotype and real life. There's always some relation, but it's much more interesting to study stereotypes on their own as a certain collective mental phenomena than to ask whether really, I don't know, Germans are punctual or Ukrainians sing beautifully or whatever. So now I have a feeling of certain audacity if I would like to go for a moment against this sound methodological principle and say a few sentences that there are certain elements of very different from those that I mentioned, talking about stereotype of mountain liberty, which should be stressed. One thing is based on the physical geography connected with politics, namely that so it happened that for most time of its history, Carpathian main ridge was political frontier, and between Kingdom and Hungary of Hungary and Romanian principalities, between Kingdom of Hungary and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, between Kingdom of Hungary and Moravia and Bohemian Kingdom. As a frontier territory, they were subject to settlement of minority ethnic groups to protect mountain passes, ad custodiam viarum, for the protection of roads. This phrase repeats itself in documents, and these peoples, be they settlers in eastern Transylvania, be they Wallachians in southern Poland, who partially came spontaneously as shepherds, but partially were consciously attracted by landowners in order to have villages close to the mountain passes in order to protect them. If one builds something which we could anachronistically call military frontier, it was not yet military frontier in the Habsburg sense, but in this old-fashioned sense of settlements, then of course you have to give certain liberties to this population in order to make settlement attractive to them. So they are less taxed, they are less. They get long time of liberty from whatever taxation in order to settle. There are certain cases in which, and I quote from memory, a 17th century royal inspection of villages, of royal villages in Poland. The phrase, they do not pay anything, they do not make any serfdom, their only task is to take care of the royal road to Hungary. About a Wallachian law village somewhere in Beskid Niski, so in southeastern Poland. So this is one element in which, in a sense, we have a certain, some sort of modern liberty. Another is, so to say, geophysical, namely because of the geomorphological situation. It's much more difficult to have agricultural villages in the mountains. We remember that every meter up is like 1 kilometer to the north in climatic terms. So it's simply colder and colder. So if there is some village on 1,000 meters above sea level, then the vegetation period is shorter than in a village, to say 300 meters above sea level. They will not, they cannot survive by agriculture only. They have to develop sheep grazing or other, and also timber industries in order to survive. Therefore, you cannot make a proper manorial serfdom economy in the mountains, because manorial serfdom economy is based on grain production, which is later exported, and the nobleman gets money for politics and luxury consumption. It doesn't work in the mountains because of physical physical geography. So this is second point. Third point is that it is, again, because of difficulty of entering mountains, it is much more difficult for the state to control the territory, both for the state and for the church. And they are beautiful examples of it mainly from 17th century, when the Eastern Christianity oscillates between united and disunited church in a way that you sometimes cannot tell the difference, in which they are Greek Catholic parishes which refer to a bishop which in one decade is Greek Catholic, but then Greek Catholic bishop is thrown away, the Orthodox bishop comes, was the case in Przemyśl to changing, but the parishes are still under him, whether he is one or another. The same in Ushhorod bishopric, which was turning itself a few times from one to another to another religion. So there is quite difficult to establish the clear religio-political allegiance, and we could go farther on up to the communist period, where obviously for the intelligentsia mountains once again became a sort of escape place from whatever that is, you always, in blessed times before mobile phones, if you took your rucksack and said goodbye to your colleagues in Warsaw and went, I don't know, to Bieszczady, and for 2 weeks you were totally outside of anything, of any politics, any communists, anything at all, and anything at all. And I think it's a generational experience, not only my personal, but generational experience of my generation and of generation before. Before myself. Of course, it has its darker side. We may say that also mountains are places of prisons and of internments, and it's not by chance that in Marmaros Siget was the famous political prison after 45, and not by chance that Cardinal Wyszyński, when he was interned by the communists, was interned in somewhere in the mountains far away in Bieszczady, because the distance, the access is difficult. Nevertheless, there is this this feeling of liberty, which is also seen which is also probably seen because for various reasons, and here I'm not sure how far it is in Transylvania, in Romanian case, but in the Polish Subcarpathia, in those parts of Polish Subcarpathia in which there was no forced population transfer after 45, there is very strong internal feeling of local communities. I would say that much stronger than in any other part of the Polish territories, which means, for example, that this neither communist state nor non-communist state is able to enforce the building law regulations because they are building whatever they like before without any legal, without caring for the legal procedures. Somebody said, some politician from Zakopane said, so it happened that in Zakopane the building regulations somehow didn't grow into our soils. We do not care them, which is of course means that there is a sort of oligarchic local, very strong oligarchic local system. But in a sense, it is this long durée of opposing central power. Okay, and this being so, we may come partially to our main topic of synchronisms and asynchronisms, because this is a story which I believe fits very well to the topic of our today's discussion, because it's one more small contribution to putting into doubt clear center-periphery dichotomy. I'm a great admirer of center-periphery dichotomy, I have to say. It helps us in many cases to, so to say, build first general scheme, so to say, somehow to order very complicated phenomena and to make sense out of chaos of facts. So on the first glance, it's extremely important. On the second glance, I would say you start to have more and more doubts. It was being repeated here, how in many papers before that we had this various ways of dealing with backwardness and periphery were by putting into doubt this clear dichotomy. And one example is for one example may be that we see that the Gershon-Kronian idea that the more to the east you go, the stronger state impulse is needed for modernization, in a sense doesn't work here and doesn't work here too much, because this is precisely the type of periphery in which the state is rather weaker than stronger than in the core regions. And another very interesting point is that at certain cases, and this was stressed very, very much by Brodel in his Mediterranean. From reading of some environmental historian, I know that it's very unfashionable to quote Brodel, and every environmental historian starts with writing that Brodel is obsolete and we go beyond him and we are much wiser than he was. So I'm ashamed to say that I enjoy Brodel very, very much. And one of the arguments in the book on Mediterranean, which contrary to the title is as much about mountains which are around the sea as about the sea, is that in certain cases, material situation of the peasantry was better, probably not in high Alps, but say in mountains of Central Massif in France, than it was in those territories which from 19th and 20th century we recognized as best developed. This intrigued me very much, because then I found in my favorite Czech historian Josef Pekař in his book about Czech taxation system, early modern taxation system, that Habsburg authorities believed that in Bohemia, in Sudeten and in Karkonosze, peasants are richer than on the flatland, and they tax them accordingly more. Pekař comments, it's absolutely against whatever we believed that we understand about early modern economy. But so to say, we see the fact there are 3 or 4 censuses. In each of them, they tax these peasants better. And one obvious explanation is, but in the mountains, it's easier to hide your sheep. So if the royal commissioner passes through a flatland village, he easily sees how big territory a given peasant has, and he can tax him. In the mountains, if you have herds, you can put into the forest. The royal commissioner will not dare to go there, will not see there, so we will tax them higher because we know they are all cheating. That's true. Another explanation is precisely the closeness to frontier and legal or illegal frontier trade, which is additional point of income. And third element, probably most interesting argument of both Pekash and Brodel and also some other authors which I encounter, is that diversification. So in a normal average year, it's better to be an agriculturalist than a sheep grazer, because from agriculture you get more income. However, if the year is bad, then it's much better to live in a village with half agricultural and half sheep grazing, because this means diversification. If there is a plague on animals, then you will still have bread from grain. If there is a plague of grain, then you can live on animals. So villages that diversificate are better equipped to survive crisis years than monocultural villages. So I'm not making a general conclusion, philosophical conclusion. What I wanted to show you, and also to show to myself, because it was also somehow a surprise to myself, that entering into a topic such far away from intellectual history as mountain history can also bring into some examples of how asynchronism survive in socio-economic life, and how the interplay between intellectual stereotypes or projects, ideological projects of land of liberty, in an easy way, or not very easily for me under explainable way, interfere with, so to say, real socio-historical situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. I was reminded that apropos Polish literature, I went to a movie in this, I think, late 70s or early 80s by a director called Janowski. And it was a sort of elegy of being distant from the town life and enjoying productive loneliness in the mountains. And I was also reminded of the strong link between mountains and liberty in the most recent Italian history. During the resistance against the occupying German army and fascist army, 43 and 45, there was the experiment of the Free Republic of the Val d'Ossola, which is high in the mountains, close to the border with Switzerland. And it was a successful experiment for quite a long time compared to the unbalance of military power. So this is the link between freedom and mountains is very strong. I think it is a sort of structural element in most of European history. And by the way, I was surprised that there is an argument in favor of wealth and mountains, since the opposite is the case in most countries. I was reminded also of Rousseau's link in the Corsican case, where poverty is the basis for freedom. If you renounce wealth, then you are free. So there are sort of parallel ways of dealing with this absolutely fascinating topic about synchronicity and asynchronicity. without much further ado, I would like to invite Professor Troebst to come to the floor. Desynchronizing anti-Slavism, please.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for the invitation, particular to Sorin. I will start with a sort of cryptic quotation of 1824 by the Slovak poet, scholar, and priest Jan Kolar, who published, interestingly enough, in Czech, his popular poem Slavi Dcera, Slava's daughter. The last line read the following: Slavme, slavne, slavu, slavov, slavnih. In English, let's solemnly celebrate the glory of the famous Slavs, unquote. So the reference of protagonists of small Slavophone proto-nations like Slovaks and Czechs to Slavdom can be interpreted as a synchronizing attempt in the direction of, in Kolar's term, Slavic brethren. The romantic idea that there is something like an ethnogenetic and cultural community of Slavs, slavische Wechselseitigkeit, Slavic reciprocity, even since times medieval, a natio slavica, proven by linguistic proximity. This idea has been picked up in the 19th century, both by political actors in the Habsburg Empire like Kolar, as well as by the new philological discipline of Slavic studies, Slavistic, again in Austro-Hungary, but also in German academia. Highlights were the Slavic Congress, Slovanský sjezd of 1848 in Prague, and August Leskin's School of Neo-Grammarians, Junggrammatiker, at Leipzig University, searching for and trying unsuccessfully to reconstruct a Slavic proto-language, Slavische Ursprache. In the political realm, the new pan-Slavic movement, aiming at support by the Russian Empire for the demands of the Habsburg Slavophones towards Vienna and Budapest, soon was turned by St. Petersburg into a tool of Tsarist imperialism. The result was a differentiation into governmental pan-Slavists in Russia and culturally orientated Slavophiles, whereas in Austria-Hungary, a patriotic K und K Austro-Slavism emerged, in contrast to a short-lived pro-Russian Neo-Slavism, as well as to an earlier South Slavism, also known as under the label of Illyrian movement. World War I then brought an end to most of these efforts, yet the Paris Peace Conference produced two new pan-Slavic phenomena: Czechoslovakism in the form of the new Czechoslovak Republic of Czechs, Moravians, Slovaks, and Rusins, and now governmental South Slavism in the form of Yugoslavism in the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes from 1930 on, then Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Despite the fact that Hitler's Germany from 1938 on destroyed the statehood of Slavic-speaking countries of Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia, anti-Slavism was not a component in Nazi ideology due to the Third Reich's Slavophone allies respectively satellites, the Kingdom of Bulgaria, the new Slovak Republic, and the equally new Ustasha state of Croatia. An unintended consequence of the German attack on the Soviet Union of 1941 was, however, the resurgence of a pan-Slavic movement orchestrated by Stalin, now under communist premises. In the fall of 1941, an all-Slav committee, Všeslavianski Komitet, was founded in Moscow, consisting of representatives of the CPSU, plus of communist parties in exile from Yugoslavia, Poland, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. Also, after 1945, did Stalin play the Slavic card in his policy towards Europe. At the Slavic Congress of 1946 in Belgrade, celebrating, quote, the apotheosis of the Slavic victory over fascism, with Slavophone participants from Europe, as well as from South America, North America, and Oceania, a new overall Slavic committee, Общеславянский Комитет, was founded as a, in quotation marks, bulwark against a resurgence of the perennial German Drang nach Osten. The committee was seated in the capital of Tito's new Yugoslavia, as was from 1947 on another coordinating body of Soviet policy towards both Eastern and Western Europe, the Information Office of Communist and Workers' Party, Kominform, the refusal of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia to bow to Soviet supremacy in 1948, however, led to an abrupt end of the synchronizing components in Stalin's Pan-Slav strategy, as well as in the Kominform project. From now on, Moscow relied exclusively on bilateral treaties with the communist states in its realm, next to the Slavophone People's Republics of Bulgaria and Poland, from 1948 on also Czechoslovakia, now also the non-Slavophone ones, Hungary, Romania, and Albania, from 1949 on also GDR. Neither the Soviet-led Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, founded in 1949, nor the Warsaw Pact Treaty Organization of 1955 did contain a Slavic connotation. Under Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev, the Stalinist perception of Slavic unity vanished, not to resurface under Putin, who instead revived the Tsarist idea of a unity of the Orthodox Eastern Slavs, that is, Russians, in Russian, Velikorossiane, Ukrainians, Malorossiane, Little Russians, and White Russians, Belorossiane, now, however, under the common label Russkie, not Rossiane, implying a common ethnicity of all three types of, in quotation mark, Russians. Furthermore, outside the post-Soviet realm, nationalism, in the neutral sense of the term, is the main reason for the fact that there is no such thing as a political Euro-Slavism, comparable to phenomena like Euro-communism, Euro-Islam, and other pan-European features. This despite the fact that beginning in 1981, the members of numerous Slavic-speaking communities from Finland to Greece became citizens of the European Community, respectively later on the European Union. Finally, from 2004 to 2013, no less than 6 Slavophone states became members of the European Union. That means that by now, some 70 million of the EU's more than 455,000 million inhabitants are citizens of Slavophone states, with another 3 million Slavophone minorities in non-Slavophone states. That makes roughly 15% of all EU citizens. Also in the first half of the 1990s, 11 new Slavophone states were founded in Europe. Thus, currently a relative majority of European states are Slavophone. The fact that despite all this, there is no all-Slavic ideology today, not even a cultural equivalent to Francophonia or Lusophonia, is the reason for the almost complete absence of anti-Slavism in non-Slavic societies. I take the German-speaking countries as an example. While in the 19th century, politicians, intellectuals, and scholars like Karl Marx, Gustav Freytag, Georg von Schönerer, or Max Weber were militantly Slavophobic on an ethnic, if not racial basis, most Germans, Austrians, and German-speaking Swiss today would have tremendous difficulties in identifying, say, Lithuanians, Bulgarians, Moldovans, or Serbs as either Slavs or non-Slavs. There still are, of course, negative stereotypes on Slavs as such, but they are, unlike Herder's positive stereotype of the diligent, peaceful, and happy Slavs, regionally and culturally not ethnically connotated. Slavic in this sense means basically East European, that is not completely Europeanized. A good example is an article in the London Economist of 1999 entitled "Setting Slavs Free," with a quintessential subtitle, and I quote it, "There is no reason why Slavs cannot be Democrats." Here, Slavic stands not only for East European, but also for post-communist. Does, however, the label Slavic make sense in area studies and other academic fields? In 2008, this question figured prominently on the agenda of the editorial board of the US-American journal Slavic Review. The reason was the decision by the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, an umbrella organization founded back in 1938, to change its name by adding two more components. American Association for the Advancement of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Naturally, the question arose whether also Slavic Review should be renamed, for example, into Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Review. The editors unanimously decided not to do so, but to keep the traditional title Slavic Review for two reasons. First, the journal's subtitle, Interdisciplinary Quarterly of Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, made the geographical scope already clear enough. The second argument sounded a bit cryptic, and I quote, "Slavic has become a largely flexible, even empty signifier in brackets outside of linguistics, which the subtitle of the journal explains." What the editorial board had in mind was obviously that in the humanities, Slavic by now functions as a connotation of something which experts can decipher, while the term itself has lost the very core of its meaning. 10 years before, in 1998, The Austrian expert on Slavic linguistics, Otto Kronsteiner, had already made a pessimistic prediction. Traditional Slavic studies will inevitably go down the drain since they are, quote, incestuous by Slavs for Slavs, unquote. In his opinion, the focus of Slavic studies in the 19th century on Pan-Slavism and Slavic reciprocity had led to a methodological and theoretical petrification of the discipline, something which was prolonged for another century by Soviet communism. Auf diese Weise, das Kronsteiners Resümee, auf diese Weise ist die Slavistik zu einer schwer durchschaubaren monolithischen Geheimwissenschaft geworden. That is, Slavic studies mutated into an opaque, monolithic, and esoteric pseudoscience. Recently, Kronsteiner's German colleague Norbert Franz came up with a similar, yet less harsh verdict. He too doubted whether the alleged medieval unity of the Slavs was sufficient to argue the raison d'etre of the academic discipline of Slavic studies. At the same time, Franz saw a way out of this dilemma, and I quote him, "For Slavic cultural studies, the thematization of Slavic discourse could be a field which, similar to the language, forms a link uniting the discipline, or rather a vanishing point for research efforts," unquote. So analyzing the Slavic discourse on Slavicness could, in his view, constitute the scholarly foundation of the discipline of Slavic cultural studies. To sum up, to revitalize the Slavic idea in the romantic sense of the 19th century or in the sense of political pan-Slavism was not possible in the 20th century and seems unlikely in the 21st. In certain instances, however, elements of Slavic solidarity can be used for political mobilization. There is, however, no guarantee that this mechanism works in every case. For instance, during the 1999 NATO airstrike campaign against Rump Yugoslavia's attempt to ethnically cleanse Kosovo of Albanians, the Russian State Duma and the Russian Orthodox Church tried to drum up what was called a Slavic levy to support militarily the Orthodox brethren in the Balkans. And Vladimir Zhirinovsky even boasted that he would charter at his own expense planes to bring several thousands of Russian volunteers and Cossacks to Serbia. Nothing came out of this attempt, and Russian critics of the right-wing political weirdo cited the acid remark by the Russian Minister of the Interior of the 1870s, Pyotr Valuyev, who had qualified Pan-Slavism not as an attempt at synchronization, but as, quote, Slavophile masturbation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very informative and thought-provoking paper. Now I would like to ask Marius Turda to give us his paper. The title is Synchronized Whiteness and the Blackness of Others. And I'm it's okay. I'm just I'm just curious because I will have face the same problem this afternoon.
No, there's no problem.
Okay.
Something.
Okay. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do not fear, I'm not going to repeat what Dragos Polajczyk said in my presentation, but there is one particular slide which I want to use from this presentation because it connects very directly to the first point of my talk and it synthesizes very nicely. So I have three sections. Oh, it's here now, so that's even better. One, it's a bit theoretical, and I'm not going to dwell too much on it because points have been made already about synchronicity. The other one is more historical and relates to examples I'm going to share with you. So I try to be as concise as possible as we are before lunch. So I hope it's going to be all right. So we did speak about synchronicity in many forms, politically speaking nowadays, of course. And this would have been quite nice in many ways if the argument presented yesterday by Balázs would have been continued into what is the Hungarian political culture today and how kind of the reinvention of kind of Hungary is the new Europe, so the new bastion of the European civilization, and how that connects to all the debate in Hungarian culture between where Hungary is situated between East and West, and the whole call to go to the East Hungarian, as the famous saying goes, and how Orbán utilizes this. So we have that political dimension, but there isn't something else which I want to highlight here, which is kind of the academic synchronicity. And this connects to certain things that some people would call today the woke culture here. And in connection to that is the whole discussion about whiteness. So let me put, all right, okay. Cum pot să pun celălalt? Da. Nu schimb tu, te rog frumos, pune ăla. Te rog, nu, pune la o secundă. I want to make a few comments which are theoretical about whiteness and how this circulates in Eastern Europe. And you've made it very nicely there, and I really like that fact that, and I think it works very well. If we look at the original function of how whiteness emerged as a critique in certain academic circles, and most of you, I think, are familiar with that. The original function of obviously to provide a new analytical framework, a new analytical lens for diffusion, adaptation, and local reception, as you put it there. But actually, when we look at Eastern Europe or East Central Europe, and particularly in countries like Romania, it becomes a very diluted way. It becomes basically a normative call for imitation without assessing consequences. So you read a lot of texts about whiteness, particularly from literary scholars related to the history of Romania, which basically they don't really know the history very well. So there's no historical substance there. And also they don't really think that there is important consequences of that particular imitation of a particular framework. And the other one is a frame for analyzing resistance, hybridity, and selective adoption. Again, those of you familiar with cultural studies in the West would have known how that was articulated as a kind of reflexive resistance to various ways of interpreting national history in connection to colonialism, imperialism, and so on and so forth. But then, of course, when we look at how it is being used here, it's basically used dogmatically as self-evident good. So a lot of people just say, well, let's decolonize Romanian studies, or let's decolonize Hungarian history or Polish history. But basically, it's used, in my interpretation at least, or my critique of it, as a dogmatic tool, rather than as a genuine attempt to reappraise particular difficult episodes in national history which relate to national identity or national character. Now, as it happens, if you do have a historical background or you are familiar with the history, actually there is a discussion about whiteness in this region, and there is a discussion about blackness in this region, which is historically important, and I think it can be done. So I'm going to give you two examples today because we don't have time to discuss more, but at least we'll give you an understanding of how I think it is important to place this conversation in this context, as you have done it with the conference and you've done it in your paper, and then actually provide a very hermeneutical, epistemological, but seriously embedded conversation or analytical analysis of historical moments that actually can illustrate that this mattered and continues to matter to this day. And now I move to my. So there we go. Right. Așa, acolo. Aici mă descurc. Mulțumesc. Okay, so this is just a very short, diluted, if I may say so, version of a number of things I already written. So those of you interested in my perspective, you could read the books or article I've written. So I'm not going to dwell too much on it. So the first one is comes from Hungary, and this is basically the whole discussion about national character and the racialization of Hungarians as white Europeans. And of course, this is a very complex conversation which cuts across art, history, literature, philosophy, theology. And Balázs wrote about it, a very important book on national character. My book on sort of conceptions of race in Hungarian debates in the modern times will come out soon. And I just want to give you one example of that. So this is basically a conversation that starts, of course, in probably early 19th century, but I'm most particularly interested in the early 1920s. So there's a very interesting conversation between a Hungarian journalist from Transylvania, from Kolozsvár. His name is Zoltán Szász, not the historian from Satu Mare, but another one. And he writes a very interesting number of articles in the 1920s about the Hungarian beauty ideal. So what is the typical Hungarian classical beauty? And he gets very, in a way, angry, on the one hand, at Hungarian racists, what we call at the time folyvedők, or protectors of the race. And at the same time, he gets very angry with those who trivialize the entire conversation for being non-important or being irrelevant now in the new political situation. He says there is a very interesting middle ground here. And so he gets very angry at this, and basically he says, if we look at the entire description or depiction of the Hungarians, they don't reflect at all our sort of Asiatic or Turanic origins. They basically, the entire production of literary figures is more in line of the Greek Roman classical tradition, where Arpad or whoever, you know, if you think of if you think of Munkács's painting, The Conquest, all of the chieftains are basically portrayed as white Europeans. This is not a reflection of how they actually look like. So he says none of our true organic character is being reflected in our literary and in our paintings and in our sculptures. And he talks specifically about Esau's grieving shepherd, Bushula Juhász. And incidentally, he's also the architect or the sculptor who did Maciej statue in Kolozsvár. He's the same person. And he gets very, there's a very interesting conversation here. We don't have time for it. I just want to allude to it. And he says, if we look at the typical Hungarian, according to any discussion about how the Hungarian should look like, well, we see basically we have this mustachioed Apollo rather than a classical, Turanic Hungarian. And he says, there's a serious problem here because we are, in a way, identified as white Europeans, but in fact, we have very little, in a way, European origins. Now, the conversation, of course, goes in many directions, and some of you already alluded to how it goes in other contexts. For me, what was relevant is that why is that a crucial conversation in terms of the debate on the national character? And it is in many ways relevant today as well, because, as I mentioned already, the whole reinvention of Turanism, and we had a picture yesterday, the new parades in Hungary about the Turanic past is becoming very important. Orban keeps talking about, let's go to the east in a way, but also because next year, some of you know, there will be 500 years since Mohács, which in a way, to any classical racial Hungarian text, was not only a national tragedy, but was the moment that in a way the pure, as it was defined by the pure Hungarian race, was basically eliminated. And since then, through constant assimilation and reshuffling of the organic texture of the nation, new people came into. But basically very few pure families were left in Hungary. So there's a completely new population that basically becomes Hungarian after 1526. So Sas gets into this conversation and he says, we really need to rethink the conversation about national character in this way. And I always thought, reading all of these texts about whiteness written by so-called colonial scholars reflecting on Eastern Europe, how little reference they have to any historical moments or any debates or even classical books, including yours, for example. Regrettably, they don't really get into the conversation about national character and national identity and how, in a way, it worked, to prove that there was, in fact, a very serious conversation about we are, in fact, white and Europeans. And of course, this is, in a way, goes back to the creation of the Hungarian state, which, as the argument goes, through Christianity, was a profoundly both existential but also anthropological transformation. We became white Europeans through the adoption of Christianity, although we were still pagan-looking or Asian-looking people. And this is very important in the way the discussion is articulated. So that's it. And then there is the other side of it. So it's not simply the identifying which parts of the national body could be protected in a way that still resembles something that goes primo hac in terms of their Turanic origin, but also, of course, by 1920s, the discussion is in connection to the Jews. And here it's very interesting because a lot of the radical rhetoric about whiteness, we are white Europeans, and they are not, is in connection to the Jews. Jews are tainted by black blood, and they are basically depicted violently, so in many texts, as impossible to assimilate because basically they are black. And there is a lot of literature on that. And like I said, I've written a book about it, so you could see in some cases, of course, this is a universal argument about particularly the East European Jews being not only backward in the cultural sense, but basically humanely, they belong to a different species. Regrettably, a lot of assimilated Hungarian Jews in Transylvania, as much as they were German Jews in Germany, looked at their Eastern brethren as being inferior species. And this would actually lead all the way until 1944, during the Holocaust, when many Neolog Jews in Budapest or even in Kolozsvár looked at Jews from Maramuresh as being inhumane, and they actually could be exterminated if we can be saved. So there's a profound conversation between us and them being the Jews in the Hungarian context in the 1920s. And we are the Europeans, we are civilized, we are white. The Jews are basically black and inferior, and they bring all of these inferior traits into our body. But also there is a very internal conversation, which is hard to grasp within the Jewish communities, assimilated Jewish communities in the region, which are very complicated. So this is one historical example that I wanted to highlight. And I think the interesting bit is that Sas, at some point, it says, we are, and that's a wonderful quote from him, if I have it here now, where it says, we are the yellow spot on Europe's white body. So the whole image that, you have this European whiteness, and it's almost like, the character from Disney, which incidentally, the first Disney film appears in 1937, right? Not the Sleeping Beauty, the other one is perfectly white. Yeah, the Sleeping Beauty was it, yeah. And there is this reference to Europe is defined in this way, obviously going all the way back to the classical tradition. Caucasian beauty is basically defined in certain ways, but it's got these spots, and we are the yellow spot. And he plays with this very interestingly, to my knowledge, yet unused by historical scholarship on how sophisticated this conversation is. So in many ways, by simply being interested in a number of reasons, a number of issues, I was able to arrive to these literary discussions and kind of artistic representation of Hungarianness I was interested in, to actually understand something that connected to a broader conversation that my book is about, which is basically about national character and race. Okay, now let me move to another example, and this is about the other, the two important minorities, or if you want, two important groups of people who I identify as the ultimate problem in the region, the Jews and the other are the Roma. And it's very interesting. This is from a Holocaust survivor, a German-born Holocaust survivor. And when I read this, I read her memoirs. And when I came across this quote, I was quite surprised by how interesting it is. So you could see, so she's in Auschwitz, and she says, they brought transport of gypsies from Hungary. Now, these gypsies are sometimes light, sometimes very dark skin, but some of them look like Negroes. And of course, there's a very, that connects with the discussion about the Roma basically being not only, again, primitive or backward, but actually displaying facial features, which brings them very close to the blacks. And very interesting, she says, since there were no colored people in Europe, we were very scared because we thought, Nazi Germany conquered America. Now, of course, she should have known better. There were a lot of Nazis in America by then already, anyway, and to this day. It's very interesting. So we are so glad that we have these Negroes coming here, but actually they were gypsies. And this is something very important and, again, very little discussed. Anti-Roma Jewish feelings. And a lot of these survivors, I've read, this is just one example, there are many. You have two categories of orientalizing the Jews in concentration camp, the Roma. This is one of them. So they are not like us. So we cannot be gassed together. I mean, they go as far to say, if I were to die, I don't want to die with a Roma person next to me. So it's like, this is just, which is impossible when you think about the context, right? How is it possible? Like you see, the other one is kind of bohemian ritualization of the Roma, which is typical in Western Europe. So a lot of the women will dress in the Roma clothes, Jewish women, and perform certain either artistic or musical acts by pretending to be Roma. So you have this acculturation that happens, and which, again, to my knowledge, no one has written anything about this. Now, I came across this because obviously I was interested into Romania to look at the other example that we have here, how the Roma was basically considered to be black in the entire rest of the Romanian racist discourse. And this is for a number of reasons we don't have time to go into. On the one hand, of course, is the whole discussion in Romanian historiography that basically Romanians were not racist towards the Roma. So until kind of I published the book demonstrating actually there's a very significant streak of racism within anti-Roma feelings. The other is that there is a lot of work, particularly by anthropologists, trying very hard to describe them as animalistic as possible, looking like monkeys, looking like gorillas. Ion Kelcha writes about the Rudari in this way. He literally describes them with kind of simian features, which is extraordinary. So you actually go at length to say they have a particular type of nose they could only be found in the big apes. It goes to say that if we were to keep some of the Roma, we only keep them in zoos as pure species. So we could come and look at them as we look at bisons and look at. So there is this, which of course has never been integrated in the debate. And then, so that's one argument. And the other one is, of course, the deportation of the Roma to Transnistria and their extermination in a way. And again, it took a very long time, but then in the end, we did find caricatures. And so we have literary description of the Roma as being black. But I finally found a caricature. This is from the most important newspaper distributed freely to all Romanian soldiers. It's called Santinela. And Gazeta Ostașească Națiunii. So this is the nation's military gazette. So this was distributed to every single soldier in the 1940s in the Romanian army. And it's interesting because obviously and this is one, Radulescu is one of the most famous Romanian caricaturists of the period. He does a lot of things. So for him, he's not the one that's the problem here. He's actually just doing it, knowing that there is a sensibility already within the army that allows for this kind of jokes to be circulated. Now, of course, there were Roma in the Romanian army, so that's important. So it's not that Roma weren't in the Romanian army. Although they deported their families, they were still in the Romanian army. And this plays with the two stereotypes which continues to today. So on the one hand, the Romas are thieves. So they stole my bread. Who stole the bread? Gypsy. Yeah, he says, and he said, what was the serial number so we can identify. And the other one, that was the interesting bit. This is why I want to show it to you. It's basically depicting him as black. And that's very important. So by the time you go, this is 1940. By the time you get to this point, and then this is basically the deportations will start, you have a visualization of them as being black. Now, I think when we talk about how ideas circulate and how debates are in connection to debates elsewhere, I think it's very important to bring this into account. And those of you familiar, and we have specialists here working on Roma history, there is a lot of work being done in how many kind of profound ways the Romanian debate on abolitionism, so the liberation of slaves, Roma slaves, was influenced by the American debates on abolitionism. And my argument was always, undoubtedly, someone like Ogolnicianu, right, who was a big promoter of the liberation of the Roma slaves, was influenced by this debate and the arguments about Romania becoming a modern state, liberty and equality, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, with that package, and Sorian and I talked about this many years, with that package came the other dark side of modernity, came the other arguments that in the West were very popular, namely, we are the pinnacle, white people are in certain way culturally more advanced, and so on, so forth, arguments that you all know very well. They applied to their colonies or they applied to minorities in their own group countries. And of course, the entire historiography, regrettably, has very carefully excised or took away any of that back connotation that could have come with the idea of liberty or equality or social emancipation. And I think we had struggled for a long time to bring this into the conversation. And ironically, although I don't write about these topics, I'm very much criticized by whiteness scholars of Romanian origin who write about literary texts like Rebreanu or Criangă. And I go and say, well, actually, the arguments you need for your theory is elsewhere. If you really want to write about that, you need to look elsewhere rather than do that. So I think it's very important to highlight these elements in terms of how crucial it was for self-identification. So yes, it's true. Romanians, they think of them as white. I'll give you one example if I have a second. In the 1930s, some of you know the Gusti School of Social Research, or the Gusti teams, as they were called, teams of students traveling across Romania, going to various villages and collecting information, everything from their customs to religious behavior to anthropology and genetics and so on and so forth. And at some point, there is a very interesting debate, again, to my knowledge, not discussed, between the two types of Roma in Romania, those in Transylvania who were enslaved and how they integrated in the Hungarian and Romanian communities, and those in Moldova and Bessarabia, it was part of Romania at the time, who were slaves, the grandparents. And there are two sociologists, they are forgotten now, regrettably, who try to explain this. So in Transylvania, many of the Roma, after the second generation, will refuse to call themselves Roma. They will either take Hungarian Romanian name and pretend they are not ethnically Roma anymore. And the sociologist says, his name is Boia, by the way, no connection with the historian, Matei Boia. He says this is a very typical understanding of how this community can actually pass as white. Now, this goes back to a very important 19th century debate started by an Austro-Hungarian, German by origin, Austro-Hungarian physician in Sarajevo after 1878, Leopold Gluck. And he comes with this idea of the black Roma and the white Roma. So for him, the black Roma are the nomadic Roma who still speak the Romanes, who are still dressed and they keep to themselves. And the white Roma are those who try to assimilate. So he looked at the Roma in Sarajevo and he came up with this typology. And Boia does this in the 1930s in Transylvania. Now, across the Carpathians in Moldova, this researcher, Dominica Păun is her name, she goes to one of these villages who used to have slaves, Roma slaves, but they were peasants, Romanian peasants. And she goes around and says, how do they integrate? What do they live? Typical sociological work. And it's a very interesting discussion with one of the old women who says, no matter how much they will change their skin, they will still be black because they are our former slaves. So to have a peasant woman very genuinely thinking that, I don't have a problem with them living in our village. I have a problem with them when she says they try to become Moldavian. And it's very, I think, interesting to understand how these ideas actually were internalized. And clearly she was an illiterate woman, I suppose. She wasn't being taught that she's white, but she knew that the Roma is black. That was her way of reference. And I don't know, in many ways, I hope there will be research being done by others. And this kind of horizontal and cross-cultural understanding of the racialization of certain groups is being finally discussed in a way that previously hasn't been done, even if it is in connection to the big debate on national character. So who are the Romanians? How do you define the Romanians? Are these people Romanians by blood or by language? Discussion that happens everywhere. So even if we start from the point of view of the majority, as it were, we push a bit the conversation in this way and enlarge a bit the boundaries of how we can understand this debate, will still be beneficial, I think, in terms of the historical reappraisal of certain things. Now, of course, you could do it, as I started with mentioning those strategies. You could simply come and say, decolonize Romanian history. These people are all racist. These people are all anti-Semitic, which to some extent probably they were. But I found that, particularly nowadays, slightly insufficient as a historical tool. And certainly insufficient in terms of discussing this publicly, because I think the public or the population at large doesn't really care about the meta language. They really understand, of course, the reality of daily life. So if you go around here or in Budapest, the anti-Roma racism is absolutely prevalent. There's no discussion about it. So they wouldn't have a problem understanding that this is a discussion that has to be had. They would probably have indifference towards any meta language you try to explain to them that is Hungarian history or Romanian history is to be decolonized in this way. I think it's interesting to see how this develops as a topic of research and in connection to what the conference and other conferences on synchronicity will bring forward, because I think there is enough now for us to bring as well to the table in terms of these groups. And these are very difficult conversation, and obviously it's not easy, but whiteness remains very powerful. And Balázs mentioned the world crisis is very interesting, because I think now we are in a new crisis, and this is being called upon by political leaders in certain ways. And of course, in any crisis, there will be a savior or a person coming to provide salvation. We could see this clearly in America. We could see this in Hungary for a while, and I think it's going to happen in Romania as well. And I think many Romanians or Hungarians or Poles or Czechs, and all of us met people like that, they generally think they are white. It comes naturally in many ways. And I think the idea of whiteness and Europeanness is very much connected. Ultimately, again, I'll give you the example from Hungary. Orban is very clearly articulating this and bringing the threads of this narrative. For example, when he spoke about the refugees or the people passing through in 2015, right? They could never, ever become European. We are the last bastion, and we need to stop that. And the discussion was ontological. Now, of course, who understood it like that? Or a couple of historians or people who are interested in this topic. The population at large understood it as these people are different than us. They come here and they will destroy us. So there is from within and from outside a genuine fear, what I call it a form of ethnic fatalism, that actually we could see now grasping or kind of embracing the population at large. And I think the last elections clearly demonstrate that we shouldn't really take this lightly. We should be very clearly aware that is relevant, is important, but also that it's got a very long history. And that history is still to be written, is not well known. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I may take just 1 minute to tell 2 anecdotes. The first one is about, it's not an anecdote, it's just an addition. The enigma of the Roma people was already there in the 18th century, and they made desperate efforts to trace their origins back to Egypt, for instance, just to explain the fact that their skin was not perfectly white. So it is really a sort of structural question in the European historiography. The second one is in a way more ironic. As you know, Northern Italy has been a part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire for quite a long time, and the Viennese government sent bureaucrats to Northern Italy, especially to Veneto, and they were collectively called gypsies. So you have family names like Zingari, and they are all blonde and light skin, and people just didn't see the problem in defining them gypsies, even against their actual physical complexion. So these are really two different sets of representations, the cultural one, the physical one. They don't match it. So it is all the more important to remind politicians that they have to be careful with definitions and ungrounded descriptions. I look to our master. We can come to a conclusion, and we shall convene again at 2:30, 2:15, 2:15 or 2:30. 2:30, that's fine. Thank you very much.